Okay, so as I said, in addition to the two parts of the weekly lecture, I was going to put up at least one more video, which would be a recap of week one. I said that I'd probably put up two videos, one which was a recap of week one, and then one which was further about the sort of discussion posts and the icebreaker thing. I'm going to see if I can't get all of that into one video, so I'm keeping an eye on the time. If this starts to go over about 15 minutes, I'll split it up into two videos. So because this will at least be the week one recap, let me start with that sort of thing. So in week one, in addition to the icebreaker, in terms of actual content, we had, as we will each week, a quiz, sort of the readings, the group discussion about the readings, and then the active reading and the summary questions. So what were we covering in the first week? We covered metaphysics, in particular arguments about the nature of and existence of God. Or at least mostly the existence of God, and we covered, if you'll recall, two types of argument. The cosmological type argument, which was the Kalam argument, where the way it goes in the attempt to support the existence of a God is you say, well, look, here's the universe, something made this, so well, we have to assume that it was something which is greater, which is not itself caused, etc., etc. And the reasoning is supposed to be the only kind of entity which could create something like the universe is God. That's essentially the way the argument runs. Obviously, to put it together in a valid format, we have to be a bit more specific. But that's the sort of elevator pitch of the argument. The second one was the ontological argument of St. Anselm, and this one did have something to do with the characteristics of God, because it argues from the sorts of characteristics that God is supposed to have to the fact that God must exist, right? So that was the one in which we had that phrase, something than which there is none greater. The idea being that this very concept, which we all have in our minds, well, because we all have it in our minds, and because we all sort of agree that existing in the real world is better than merely existing in the mind, we can conclude that this thing, something than which there is none greater, must exist in the real world. So therefore, God exists. Again, that's the sort of very short thumbnail sketch of the argument. To spell it out in a valid way, we have to go through all the premises as they're set out in the book and in the PowerPoint slides. So that's what we went over in the slides for the first week. In your individual reading and your group discussions, you were dealing with Nietzsche's death of God argument. So I have explained a little bit about the received interpretation of that argument in the beginning of the week 2 lecture, but I'll reiterate here a little bit what I say there. Generally, the argument is taken to mean that Nietzsche says, look, belief in God started fading, started being less frequently invoked to explain every little thing. And in the place of that belief was placed a scientific, naturalistic worldview. And the idea is that, well, when you stop using God to explain these everyday things, you have to use something. So the general idea here is that whenever you remove one type of explanation, whether it be supernatural, natural, whatever, you have to put something in its place. There's a vacuum left. Now, more particularly, Nietzsche says that it doesn't look like anything which fills that vacuum is any more rational than a different choice, right? So according to Nietzsche, the concept of God is just as rational in filling that explanatory role as is a scientific or naturalistic worldview. So he thinks that there is something common to any type of explanation that you put there, that you use to sort of satisfy yourself about how the everyday goings of your life proceed. And the common thing there is simply that, this will to truth is what Nietzsche calls it. This idea that, well, we're just kind of assuming that this is the way things work. Not quite that we're making it true, right? But it's close to that idea. So that's why he uses the metaphor of us having killed God. For Nietzsche, we killed God in the same way that we kind of created God. So instead of God creating us, we create God by sort of using that concept to explain things. We make it real by doing that. That's what the will to truth is sort of just using something to explain these things in our life. And so, again, whatever we use to explain things in our life becomes real in that sense and stops being real when we stop using it. And again, I use real here in sort of scare quotes. Suffice it to say that Nietzsche doesn't think that these things actually exist, right? These objects of science or these supernatural objects. He just sort of thinks that the world is there in some way and leaves it more or less at that. There's a lot more to say about interpreting Nietzsche, but the important thing that I want to sort of make clear from having looked at people's discussion contributions is that Nietzsche is definitely not in favor of the scientific worldview. He does not rate that as being in some way superior to the religious worldview, which is not to think that he says the religious worldview is particularly good in the first place. He refers specifically to Christianity because that's the context in which he was he grew up, in which he operated. But he knew a lot about the ancient world, and he thinks of the Christian worldview, the concept of God and all that attends to it. He thinks that that is sort of worse than the ancient worldview. If anything, Nietzsche takes the ancient worldview, and to that when he's referring to that, he's referring to the ancient Greeks, where what was prized was kind of valor and strength rather than meekness. He thinks that that ancient worldview is superior to the Christian morality. So in his other works, he talks about the Christian morality sort of being a morality of weakness, a morality of resentment and that sort of thing, where the weak resent the strong and kind of force them to limit themselves. So that's very vaguely and sort of in short detail what's going on in Nietzsche's head, what's going on in his other works, which sort of informs the argument that you have seen a brief picture of. So hopefully you find that illuminating and interesting, and this is the kind of thing that I'm going to do each week after you have your discussions and you write your individual summaries. I haven't looked at the individual summaries yet. Once I do, I'll have an idea of whether or not people came to what I've called the received interpretation on their own or not. And when I grade the individual summaries, I will to some extent be grading you on whether or not you've picked out the argument correctly. So again, for the first week and all of the assignments, as long as you made a good attempt, you'll get full credit. As time goes on, now that I've sort of, given you an idea of, and once you have the feedback, you'll have a better idea of what I'm looking for from you, then I'll sort of grade you a bit more harshly. So with respect to grading, I will I will have all of that done by this coming Sunday, and that's generally how it will go. One Sunday will come around and the assignments for that week will be due, and then over the next week I will grade them, and within a week's time of you having turned them in, you will have feedback and grades for them. That's how it's going to work. So you may see that you may learn that other people have had their assignment graded at some point during the week and you haven't yet. Don't worry, I will get to you by the end of this Sunday. you shouldn't sort of worry about it unless Sundays come along and you still don't see a grade, you still don't have any feedback. Then you can sort of send me an email to sort of tell me, oh, I think you forgot me, I think you overlooked my submission, or something to that effect. So I think that's enough for this particular video. It's gone about 10 minutes. So that's the summary of week 1. And as I said, I'm going to do another video where I talk about the icebreaker discussion. And let me end this talking about what I want you to do in your reading sequence group discussions. So people did eventually start submitting things, towards the end, on the weekend a bit. As long as you get it in by the due date, that is technically fine. I would much rather you do it by sort of midweek, by the end of the day, Friday, just so that we have a good sort of back and forth going and everyone's not rushing to put in their submissions in the last day and a half or so. Because then people aren't going to really read what each other say. They're not going to respond. There were a couple of groups in which there were some good back and forth responses, or at least some evidence that people were paying attention to what their group members were writing. With respect to that, when you respond to somebody, so it may be that you agree with what they said. You think they've made a good point. And for the most part, I saw people saying, oh, you've made a good point. I agree with you. I agree with you because of this reason. Hopefully, I mean, it sounds kind of strange to say this, I hope that you disagree with each other at some point during the course. And I'm almost positive that on some of the subject matters you will, because I don't want these discussion forums to just be people kind of telling each other, oh, that's a good point, right? Obviously, when you disagree with somebody, do so civilly, and say, oh, I think you're wrong, and here's why I think you're wrong, and refer to the text or to our discussion in the lecture where necessary. But do kind of engage, have back and forth discussions, do more than just sort of read and then type on somebody's post, oh, that's very nice, I didn't think of it that way. Something a little more substantive than that going forward.